So let's talk about what it looks like from community perspective, and then let's sit that alongside of this Western knowledge that we need to learn. And so that's kind of what I'm trying to share with you today. What does that look like in a math class? How does that go? I'm going to tell you a little bit about my framing, how I frame my work. So, of course, the biggest part is the relationship stuff that I've just talked about. Being in community, recognizing the knowledge that's there in community, and honoring that knowledge. But I also draw on literature, because I'm an academic and I have to. So one of my models that I use quite regularly to think about equity is this model that was developed by Rochelle Gutierrez, who's a scholar in the US. And Rochelle says that when we talk about equity, we often focus only on access and achievement, right? So if you think about equity and you think about, when we worry about kids not doing as well on assessments, or we talk about the achievement gap, right? We're really worried about whether or not they're doing well on some standardized assessment, and we rarely question whether or not that standardized assessment is culturally biased. That's a conversation for another time. But we often worry about kids' achievement, right? We want kids to be successful in math, but we never question math itself. Or we want to make sure that kids have access to good programs, higher levels of math. We want to make sure that they take calculus so they can go on to science in university or things like that. So we care a lot about access and achievement when we talk about equity, and most people, that's where it ends, right? And so most of the time, the discourse around equity in education is really about access and achievement. And Rochelle says that's not enough, because that doesn't get at the systemic problems. I talked to you earlier about settler colonialism, right? It created a systemic issue in that we have a system, we have discourses in our nation that have said forever that some people are superior to others, right? The whole residential school system was about forcing Indigenous kids to assimilate into Western culture because there was a presumption that Western culture was better. Murray Sinclair says it really well. If you've ever looked at he's got a little video when he introduced the Truth and Reconciliation report, and he says, for generations we've been told, right, these myths around cultural superiority, and it took us a long time. It lives in our consciousness because it's been so dominant in our discourse. So it's going to take us a long time to undo that, right? Marie Batiste, who's a Mi'kmaq scholar, says that we've been marinating in colonialism. And so it's hard for us even to see it, right? Because it just informs, we've normalized it. And so it's hard to then think about what decolonizing might look like. And so in order to attack some of those systemic issues, we actually have to think about things like identity and power. And this is what Gutierrez calls the critical axis. So if I'm talking about identity, do my students get to see mirrors of their own culture in math class and windows into other cultures? Do they get to see mathematics that comes from their own cultural traditions? Do they get to learn that? Do they get to learn about people who look like them who did mathematics? Right? Do they get to learn about mathematics in ways that align with their own worldview, their own ways of knowing, being, and doing? That's the identity piece. For some kids, mathematics says every day, you don't belong here. You don't belong here. You don't belong here. Right? In very subtle ways. It says, like, because there are these values, and we like to think that math is completely value neutral, like 2 + 2 is 4. I get that so often from people who don't want to acknowledge that mathematics is actually rooted in a cultural tradition, and it is. There are values in mathematics that we perpetuate with mathematics, some of the things around control and structure and exactness that are rooted in certain cultural traditions. And a lot of kids feel like that has nothing to do with them, it's not about them. And sometimes the cost of participating in mathematics is too high, and so they choose not to, right? Or they feel like they can't. My best analogy for this, I'm going to tell you a little story. Years ago, I liked to sing. In fact, having a microphone in my hand makes me want to sing, but that's a whole other thing. I like to sing, and so a few years ago I thought, because I need a life outside of work, because I don't have one, I thought I would join a community choir. And so I went with a couple of my colleagues and I joined this community choir. And it became really apparent that the people in the community choir had come from very different walks of life than I had. I grew up in a working class family in an impoverished community. I feel very uncomfortable with people sometimes who grew up with much more high socioeconomic status than me. Even to this day, I work in a university, I make enough money that I have to put my name on a list that gets published, but I still feel like that working class kid, right? And in this choir, there were people who were saying, oh yes, everyone knows this song. Oh yes, you'll know this. Oh, everyone knows it. Oh yes, when I was traveling with my parents in Asia, and everything they said made me feel like I didn't belong. Because I didn't know the song, because the drug dealer who lived next door did not play that music. And I didn't have these experiences. I haven't traveled the world. The first time I was on a plane, I was 27 years old and I was taking kids on a grad trip that they had fundraised for. We came to Toronto. So I didn't have those experiences growing up. So I always felt like I didn't belong in this choir. So I quit, because I didn't need that. I didn't need people making me feel bad about myself every day. The difference is that kids feel like that in math class all the time, but they can't quit, right? They feel like that in school all the time, that what we normalize in school is about the dominant culture, and we other the stuff that's about the non-dominant cultures. And kids feel like they don't belong because what's taken as shared isn't shared by them. And so kids will leave school because the cost of participation is too high. It's painful to be told every day you don't belong, even in quiet, subtle ways. So that's about the identity piece. The other piece is about the power piece. Do kids have the power to influence what happens in their classroom? Like I told you about the kids who say, hey, miss, let's learn about medicines, traditional medicines in class, right? Do kids get to do that in their math class? Do they get to bring in their own culture, their own ways of knowing, their own ways of being into the math class? Do they have the power to influence what happens in math class? And also, do they see the power of mathematics to influence what happens in their own community? So do they see that math is a tool with which we can read and write the world? Do they get to do things like social justice projects where they look at systemic inequity and use math as a tool to do that, right? Can they use math as a lens to solve problems like global warming or climate change or, water security, which is a big issue in many First Nations communities in this country? So Gutierrez says, if we're really going to have equity, sure, we need to talk about good pedagogical strategies that work around access and achievement, but we also need to talk about identity and power and ensuring that we're tackling some of those systemic inequities that play out in our school system.